Thomas and Friends has been one of the longest running kids shows, starting in 1984. Originally, it used to use models, but transitioned into CGI in 2008 and 2009. It's really come a long way, and I was glad to be one of the people working on it. I worked for Hit Entertainment as one of the show's writers. I still work for Hit, but no longer work on the actual show, since Mattel has recently bought Hit. They're completely changing the show into something called Thomas and Friends. Big World, Big Adventures, which I'm pretty sure is going to be a total failure. The main reason I stopped working on the show was because my favorite two characters, Edward and Henry, got the boot and were to be replaced by two new female characters, which I hated. Mattel thought it was better this way because the Steam team was unbalanced in terms of gender. Only one female engine, 6 male. However, I thought this was a horrible idea because Thomas and Friends already had an almost equal audience of male and female viewers, thus rendering the addition of these characters completely pointless, besides benefiting to the plot, which is Thomas going on adventures around the world with one of the female characters, I guess. Instead of working on the show, I created individual shorts with a group of my favorite co-workers, which are almost often focused on Edward and Henry rather than Thomas. They are aired on TV, but also uploaded to YouTube. Anyway, enough with that. It's time to get to the point of the story. It was March 5th, 2015. The Adventure Begins, my favorite Thomas and Friends special, had just been released on March 3rd. I was proud of myself for helping with it. But that day, I was browsing through a bunch of documents about the show when I discovered one called Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge, Restricted. This got me confused. I kept track of all the Thomas and Friends episodes, and I knew that there wasn't one called Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge. I asked my boss about this document, and he said, "Oh, that?" he asked, seeming slightly concerned. In 1988, an episode was going to be made called Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge, but it was never aired. Why? I asked. Well, it was supposed to be a regular episode, my boss explained, although it wasn't a part of the season, as the last season before the episode was made in 1986, as you know. The episode was supposed to happen like this. Thomas was doing something normal, and his brakes began to fail. He was going towards an unfinished bridge with a bunch of passengers inside a coach he was pulling. Luckily, Edward saw this and managed to stop Thomas by copping up to the couch and applying his brakes. Somebody working at the company made a draft of the episode and sent it to the show's main creators in the VHS tape. I think the guy's name was Eric. Then the company noticed some things in the draft, and they fired the person who made it and canceled the entire episode. But why? I wondered. We don't even know. Now, we don't want to either, my boss answered. And what happened to the VHS tape, if I may ask? I told you that the company kept it, but it was stolen by somebody. Nobody knows where it went, he said. This was sort of creepy. I should have ignored this Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge thing, but my curiosity often overpowered me in life. And this was one of those occasions. When I got home that same day, I searched Amazon for anything called Thomas and the Unfinished Bridge. Surprisingly enough, I actually found an old VHS tape with the same name, being sold by an account which had a username of a bunch of random characters, letters, and numbers specifically. I found this odd and thought maybe I should stop there, but my curiosity got the better of me again. I ordered the VHS tape. It took 8 days for the tape to arrive before it finally did on March 13th, Friday the 13th. What an odd coincidence. I connected my VCR to my TV and inserted the tape into the player. What was on the tape began to play. What I saw was way too scary and dark and depressing for a kid's show. There was no title screen. Instead, the episode just started. This was understandable because apparently the tape contained a draft. It started off normally enough with a shot of Thomas chugging through a forest happily, carrying a coach of full passengers behind him. There were two things that were slightly odd, though. First off, there was no narration, even though there is a narration in practically every other episode of the show. And second off, instead of pulling Annie and Clarabelle like he'd usually do while transporting passengers, he was pulling a faceless coach. Then, the episode showed Thomas approaching a station, presumably the one where he would drop off the passengers. He tried to apply his brakes and they failed. That's exactly what my boss said. This was exactly what was supposed to happen. Thomas went straight through the station, unable to stop, as the people on the station gave it confused looks. The classic runaway theme used in the show during situations similar to these started playing. Next, there was a shot of the front of Thomas. However, there was a scared expression on his face. And then a shot from behind Thomas appeared. It showed him passing a sign reading, "Warning, unfinished bridge ahead." This episode was already slightly intense for children, but it didn't seem too bad yet. Then, there was a shot of the passengers inside the coach. They were screaming in terror, and their screams seemed hyper-realistic as well. Then a wide shot showed Thomas passing a siding where Edward was resting. Edward noticed what was happening and sped onto the track going towards Thomas. Soon he got to the coach. However, since it was a coach, there was no one there to couple Edward to it. This was a serious problem. There was another shot of inside the coach with more realistic screams. And then there was an extremely wide shot showing Thomas getting dangerously close to the unfinished bridge. Then there was a shot of inside of Thomas's cabin. His driver said, "The brakes are working again!" By far, that was the only speaking line in the entire episodes besides the screams. Then it showed Thomas. He was probably supposed to apply his brakes, but he didn't. Instead, he smiled and sped up even faster. Things were getting seriously messed up at this point. The runaway theme began in a lower pitch, becoming distorted and demonic sounding, with screams playing in the background. Thomas began to laugh. Then as I watched with horror, he plunged straight over the side of the He plunged straight over the side of the bridge with the coach. I saw Edward brake behind him just before he went over too. Thomas and the coach landed on a bunch of rocks, getting better. He fell down and he was gone. There was one more shot of inside the coach, now half submerged in water. Dead bodies started appearing out of the water. They were everywhere. Then, the screen faded to static for about 10 seconds before a scene was then shown of Edward watching in terror as Sir Topham Hatt used the blowtorch to take off Thomas's face, which showed an expression of pure pain and horror, tears running down his cheeks, and Sir Topham Hatt took off his face, which immediately came lifeless, and threw it into a nearby pool of molten metal. The face melted away.
"You deserve this, and much more,"
Topham said angrily. 10 seconds of static before another scene appeared. Edward was in the smelter's shed. His driver and firemen were nowhere to be seen. His tender wasn't there either. Without Thomas, "I am worthless. I must join him again," Edward murmured. I watched as the claw came down and grabbed Edward. It pulled him upward and dropped him into a huge pool of molten metal. He melted in the pool on screen. His face melted last, which was horrifying enough, but even worse was that just before his face melted, it could be seen that he had an expression of happiness. Then the episode faded to static for good. I took the VHS tape out of the VCR and I snapped it in half. Nobody would ever have to see this horrific excuse for an episode again, I thought to myself. Later I noticed that the username of the Amazon account which sold me the tape wasn't just a random letters and the numbers, it was something encoded in base 64, an encoding scheme that converted words into random letters, numbers, and sometimes other character. After running the username through a base 64 decoder, it came out as a URL for a website. When I visited the website, it was just a couple of sentences written on a blank page. But those sentences scared me. Children need to know what really happens in the world. I'll make sure it's not hidden from them. Eric.